My friends, this is a moment of pride and of gratitude. The first thing I want to say is to thank the Leader of the Opposition, John Howard, for the generosity of the comments that he made.
The year is 1987 in Australia, and in July, Bob Hawke was returned with a slightly increased majority after defeating John Howard in the federal election. My name's Tim.
I'm Cameron.
I'm Francis.
It seems hard to imagine now, but there wasn't a dedicated road between Adelaide and Darwin up until 1987 in Australia. There was a road, but it wasn't an all-weather road, a proper sealed road, and that was finally completed in February of 1987. Now, he was already a very big celebrity in Australia, well known as an entrepreneur and just a general famous Aussie, really, somebody who represented what Australia is. But in 1987, Dick Smith, Cameron, did something amazing.
Yeah, so it was 1987 when Australian entrepreneur Dick Smith became the first person to reach the North Pole by helicopter. In 9 hours, he had left and returned to northern Canada after landing at the North Pole at about 7:15 a.m. Sydney time. He took photos of the icy island before leaving and labelled the trip as most fascinating.
Most fascinating. Most fascinating. I don't know what it is about a very rich businessman. They all go into adventures, ridiculous adventures. I mean, they can afford, Air Force One if they wanted to, but no, They want to get into a rickety old helicopter and fly through ice.
Yeah.
Also in April of 1987, there was a Legionnaires outbreak. Now, they happen, fairly regularly in Australia, but not to this extent. There were 45 confirmed cases around Wollongong in New South Wales and 9 deaths by July of 1987. And Francis, 1987 was a very sad year for gun violence in Australia.
Yes, mostly in Victoria. On the 9th of August, the Hoddle Street Massacre happened, where 7 died and 19 were seriously injured. Julian Knight, who was the shooter, was later sentenced to 7 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment with non-parole of 27 years. And then, on the 8th of December, at Queen Street in Melbourne, Frank Vitkovich, there was another massacre, and it was a spree killing, and there was 9 fatalities and 5 people injured.
And then I think he actually threw himself off the building.
Yes.
And earlier in the year, in 1987, in June, in fact, police shot dead a West German tourist, Joseph Schwab. He was believed to have shot and killed 5 people in northern Australia in a period of 11 days. So it was a very violent year in Australia in 1987.
Terrible.
Now, in previous podcasts, we've spoken a lot about Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, who were, of course, originally charged with the murder of their daughter Azaria, or Michael as an accessory after the fact. Now, in 1987, the Mauling Report, as it was known, was tabled in the Northern Territory Parliament, and it resulted in a pardon for Lindy and Michael Chamberlain. They had already been released from prison after, famously, the piece of clothing of Azaria's was found and identified by Lindy, but they were actually pardoned in 1987. And if my recollection serves me, there was a lot of supporters around Australia who were very insulted by that, because a pardon sort of means, you did it, you were involved, but we pardon you. It's not a vindication of the crime.
I never knew that.
In one of our previous podcasts, we spoke about the Father's Day massacre at Milperra in Sydney. Now, in 1987, after a trial lasting almost an entire year, 30 members of rival motorcycle gangs were found guilty, 9 of murder and 21 of manslaughter. Francis, 1987 was also the year of Black Monday. Tell us about that.
Yes, Black Monday was on the 20th of October, which was a Tuesday here, so it's Black Tuesday in Australia, where it was one of the biggest market crashes in history. In Australia, the All Ordinaries fell 25%, making it the biggest one-day drop in the market's history. After Black Monday, because it also had big drops in Japan, China, Spain, United Kingdom, and Canada, all the main, and New Zealand was actually hit the biggest with 60%. It fell.
Now, it was towards the end of 1987 in Australia where famous Premier Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen resigned as Premier of Queensland. He actually retired from Parliament as well, replaced by Mike Ahern. Cameron, what else was happening in 1987?
Well, yeah, I have a few quick mentions to go through because a lot of things happened this year. So Australia begins the production of the $2 coin to replace the $2 note.
Yay!
Yeah.
I love it. I love the sound a $2 coin makes when it hits the cement. I can always tell if it's worth turning around when you hear that little particular note. Whereas if you hear a little 5-cent tinny hit on the cement, you don't even turn your head. But when you hear that $2 one, you turn around and hope that the person whose pocket it fell from hasn't quite noticed.
And with the notes, you can't hear anything at all.
No, and I have to say the $2 and $1 note, and probably all notes, they had this little metal strip that ran through them.
Oh.
I don't know if that was a security thing or whatever, but I used to, this is a terrible thing to admit, but I used to rip open the notes so that I could get to that. It almost looked like a little bobby pin.
Oh.
Somebody can leave a comment about that. And they replaced it with these notes much later on, of course, that had holograms and all kinds of other currency technology.
Wow. And Brisbane had a bad year because it was hammered by a severe storm, damaging houses and power services. And then the same year, a maximum security prison had an outbreak involving 5 prisoners. They all escaped. The federal government announces legislation recognising Aboriginals as the first and original owners of Australia.
Finally going through Parliament.
Yep. The hit song of the year is Locomotion by Kylie Minogue.
Now, Locomotion turned out to be one of the biggest songs of the 1980s. Took people by storm. It's really important to note that that version that went to number 1 in Australia, which has the famous chug, 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 chuggity, chug, 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 it went to England, and Stock Aitken and Waterman, who of course went on to produce Kylie and make her a worldwide phenomenon, they didn't like the version at all. They hated it. They detested it. They thought it was amateurish. I thought it was brilliant. But yeah, they really added, that slick professionalism to it by the time it got to England and Stock Aitken and Waterman.
Wow.
It was number 1 for 7 weeks in Australia in 1987. And I am not joking, dance floors around this country just used to be swarmed when that song was played.
Yeah.
1987 was also the year that the Grim Reaper ad was introduced.
The fact is, over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead.
It depicted a Grim Reaper bowling a ball down a bowling alley. And it was a horrific ad, it really was. It's still horrific when you watch it today. It was to raise awareness about HIV and AIDS, and the message was, of course, that it affects everyone in the community, not just certain sectors of the community. So Grim Reaper bowling balls, knocking down children, babies, families, women. It scared the absolute bejesus out of anyone under 10 years of age in this country in
really
1987.
horrible.
It certainly did. It was an interesting ad in the sense that, should it have been aired, was it over the top? Possibly. But did it get its message across? Oh, hell yes.
A fear tactic, I guess.
But AIDS can be stopped, and you can help stop it.
In television, Neighbours was becoming the thing to watch in 1987, but another institution, Francis, wound down,
Countdown.
came to an end.
Yes. On the 19th of July, in 1987, it aired its final episode on ABC. The show every week was hosted by Molly Meldrum, who would show, it was part of the Australian culture by then. It would bring new artists and songs every week, and most of our hits have come from that, as well as most of the biggest favourites of Australian hit music scene came from that show. That it was first introduced by that show to many people.
Yeah.
For example, ABBA mostly came from that show.
Yep, and they still to this day credit the beginning of their career to Countdown. Molly Meldrum. When Molly Meldrum said something was going to be hot, it became hot. I mean, that includes Cold Chisel. I mean, anyone you get to mention around that. And in fact, the song out of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Let's Do the Time Warp, was never intended to be a song, but they often credit Countdown as punching that to the top of the charts as well. It ran for 13 years, I believe, Countdown, and just came to a very natural end in 1987. It's also worth mentioning that in 1987, Coffs Harbour on the New South Wales mid-north coast became a city. Its population reached that threshold where it could formally be known as Coffs Harbour, the City of. And we'll finish off with music of 1987. Of course, we mentioned Kylie Minogue, Locomotion, the biggest single in Australia that year, but we also had a few other tracks, and we'll take you out from this podcast with one of those. We had La Bamba, I love that song, Old Time Rock and Roll by Bob Seger, Slice of Heaven, which was out of Foot Rot Flats, I think the film was. Horrible film, horrible, terrible. I went to the movies, my older brother made me sit through the whole thing.
Oh.
And he accused me of crying, even though I was bored out of my brain. Apparently there was a sad part. He claims I cried and told everyone that I knew and that our family knew that, he cried. I'm like, no, I was actually almost asleep under my chair. Respectable by Mel and Kim, another Stock Aitken and Waterman song. And of course, Electric Blue by Icehouse. Walk Like an Egyptian was big as well. And that was 1987 in Australia.